"Ma'am, the nation owes you more than it can ever repay." The words cut through the thick silence like a blade. Gasps fluttered around the funeral hall, followed by a stillness so complete it pressed against my skin. I sat at the very back, on the folding chair nearest the exit, where no one had bothered to leave a reserved sign. The air smelled of lilies, sweat, and repressed judgment. Eyes turned, some wide, some narrowed, but none more startled than my sister's, standing at the front with her eulogy still warm on her lips. A few minutes earlier, she'd looked directly at me and said, "Some people vanish so long, we forget they were ever part of this family. And honestly, that's for the best." I didn't flinch then. I'd prepared myself for the barbs, the stares, the whispered speculations about what I'd become after vanishing for over a decade, but I wasn't prepared for this. The man who said it wore no visible rank, no medals, just a black suit and a pin only a select few would recognize. The DIA. I should have expected them. I told myself not to hope for anything, but here they were, right on cue, standing behind the coffin of the woman who birthed me, and who never, not once, asked where I'd gone. I came to bury my mother, but something else was about to be laid to rest too. I was born into a family that wore duty like armour and reputation like medals. My father was a decorated Navy captain. My mother, once a cryptologic linguist for the CIA, walked like every room saluted her. Dinner conversations were filled with war stories, code names, and whispered pride in things unspoken. Except when it came to me. My sister, Olivia, was the star. Blonde, sharp-jawed, and moulded from everything our parents admired. Captain of the debate team, married a Marine colonel at 25, and birthed 2 children by 30. She never raised her voice because she never had to. She spoke, and the room adjusted to hear her. I, on the other hand, learned early how to silence my presence. When I was 8, I brought home a painting I was proud of. My mother barely glanced at it before pushing it aside and saying, "Olivia just got selected for the state math team. Let's not clutter the table." I said nothing, tucked the painting under my bed, and didn't pick up a brush again. I wasn't a bad kid. But in a family that demanded excellence by their own definition, I was noise. I read too much fiction, asked too many questions, and never showed interest in ROTC or following orders. Once, at 13, I told my father I didn't want to go to the Naval Academy like Olivia. He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Then don't expect much from life." That sentence followed me like a shadow. The older I got, the more invisible I became. At family events, I was the one forgotten in group photos. At my own high school graduation, they brought flowers. For Olivia, who was giving the keynote speech, no one ever asked what I wanted, so eventually I stopped offering. And when I left home at 21 without saying goodbye, no one came looking. When I left home, it wasn't a rebellion, it was self-preservation. I bought a one-way bus ticket west with the little cash I had and a duffel bag of second-hand clothes. No destination, no plan, just distance. At first I worked tables, diners, truck stops, anywhere that didn't ask too many questions. I liked it, being anonymous, no expectations, no comparisons. For the first time, I could breathe. But that anonymity didn't last. It started at a dive bar off a military highway outside El Paso. I was serving beer to a man with a half-burned sleeve and a scar running down his neck. He watched me carefully as I spoke Spanish to a group of truckers, then shifted to perfect Arabic when a Jordanian officer walked in. I didn't think much of it. Languages had always come naturally. My mother taught me ciphers before she taught me lullabies. The man left a napkin on the table when he walked out. No tip, just an address. I almost threw it away, but something about the way he'd looked at me, like he knew what I didn't even know yet, made me hold on. 3 weeks later, I stood in a small building behind a bookstore in Albuquerque, being handed a contract I wasn't allowed to keep, and asked one question. Do you want to disappear forever? I didn't answer right away. But they already knew. Training began that winter. The details are fuzzy now, intentionally so. I signed papers that erased my name, buried my records, and renamed my entire existence. I was no longer the disappointment of a military family. I was an asset, a shadow. Somewhere in those years, I stopped checking birthdays. I stopped reading news from home. I stopped wondering if Olivia ever thought about me. She had her world, full of medals and speeches. I had mine, full of silence, survival, and scars no one would ever applaud. I remember bleeding in the back of a livestock truck somewhere outside Tabriz. The metal floor was cold against my cheek, the air thick with diesel and goat hair. I'd been shot, low, left side, just above the hip. Not clean, not fatal, if I was lucky. My handler had vanished. The safe house was burned. I was 29. The op was supposed to be simple, extract a rogue engineer who wanted asylum, but someone had tipped off the local militia before we got there, someone with clearance. I survived because I bit down on my own tongue and played dead. I woke up 2 days later in an abandoned clinic, patched together by a sympathetic pharmacist who never asked for my name. Later I learned why the mission had failed, a communication breach traced to an encrypted network used only by US intelligence affiliates, and the exact code used to access my op files was identical to a login once linked to Olivia's husband. I never saw the full file, just fragments, redacted and sealed, but it didn't take a genius to guess. My return to the field was quick. There's no room for grief or betrayal in intelligence work. You compartmentalize. You smile when needed. You disappear again. But something changed that year. A seed of doubt, of rage, of mourning for a family I no longer trusted. And yet, not everything was hatred. I used to keep a photograph, worn at the edges, creased down the middle, my mother, young, in uniform. Her smile not yet hardened, her eyes soft. I remember once when I was 5, she sang me a lullaby in Russian, clear, low, tender. It was the last time I remember her touching my hair. That image haunted me more than anything Olivia ever said. Because even after the betrayals, even after the silence, I still wanted to believe she'd loved me. But belief is dangerous, especially when the truth is classified. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, no stamp, just a plain white envelope slid beneath the door of the safe apartment I hadn't used in 3 years. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Your mother has passed. The funeral is this Sunday. You may come, if you still have the decency to face her. No name. But I knew the handwriting. Olivia's script had always been sharp, slanted, like she carved her words with a scalpel. I read the letter once, then again. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I'd spent years preparing for this moment, the final tether snapping. But the part I wasn't ready for was how empty I felt. I sat at the window for a long time, watching an old man sweep his porch across the alleyway. Sunlight pooled in his doorway. He paused, leaned on his broom, and smiled at nothing in particular. I couldn't remember the last time someone smiled at me without agenda. Part of me wanted to toss the letter into the sink and burn it. That would have been clean, righteous. But I didn't. Because something inside me, it wasn't forgiveness, not even closure, wanted to look them in the eyes, one last time, to see what remained of the people who'd buried me long before they buried her. So I packed light. No weapons, no contact lenses, no disguises, just black clothes, a notebook, and the photograph of my mother in uniform folded into the inside lining of my coat. The same photo I hadn't looked at in over a decade. I booked a rental under a false name, habit, not necessity, and plotted a route that avoided every major camera zone between Virginia and Pennsylvania. It wasn't about fear, it was about control. And I wasn't going back to grieve. I was going back to end something. The drive north was long and silent. I took back roads through old mining towns and hollowed-out suburbs, past gas stations with hand-painted signs and diners frozen in time. I didn't play music. The quiet felt cleaner, like a vacuum where ghosts could surface without warning. Somewhere near Harrisburg, I stopped at a rest area. I sat in the car with the engine off, staring at the vending machines buzzing under flickering lights. A family pulled up nearby, mother, father, boy in a Little League uniform. They laughed about something. I didn't catch the words. It reminded me of a day when I was 10. We were at the Navy base for a summer family event. Olivia had just won a junior cadet medal for some orienteering exercise. She was beaming, surrounded by officers and proud applause. I wandered off, bored, and found myself in a supply tent, tugging at the edge of a map that didn't belong to me. A woman approached, mid-30s, sharp but kind eyes. She crouched beside me and said, "Maps don't just show you where to go, they show you where not to return." I never saw her again. But years later, I would remember her face. She worked for the agency. She was the first field operative I'd ever met, and neither of us knew it yet. Back in the present, I realized my hands had gripped the steering wheel too hard. The scar above my left hip pulsed, phantom pain maybe, or a warning. I started the car. By nightfall, I was nearing the town I once called home. The trees lining the highway looked exactly the same, tall, silent, judgmental. And as the funeral home's lights came into view, I knew, whatever happened tomorrow, I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for the truth, even if it burned everything down. The funeral home was smaller than I remembered. Cream-coloured bricks, 2 clean windows, the smell of artificial lavender wafting from the vents. It used to be a bank. Now it stored the dead and the polite lies people told about them. I stepped inside and silence followed me like a second shadow. The room was packed, polished shoes, dark suits, pearls and pressed collars. My mother had connections. The intelligence community never forgets its own, even in death. But no one turned as I entered, not right away. Then someone recognized me. I don't know who it was. Maybe a cousin, maybe an old neighbour. A sharp breath, a murmured name. Like a drop of ink in water, the reaction spread, slow, insidious. Heads swiveled, eyes narrowed, smiles froze. I walked calmly toward the back of the room, heels tapping against marble tile. My dress was simple, black, long sleeves, no jewellery, no makeup. I didn't want attention. I got it anyway. "Excuse me, miss," said a voice near the guest book, a young man in a too big suit, probably an intern from the funeral staff. "The front rows are reserved for family." "I know," I said, without pausing. He hesitated, unsure whether to challenge me further. He didn't. There were no name cards on the seats except for the first 2 rows. Olivia's name was embossed in gold beside her husband's. I scanned the 3rd and 4th rows. Nothing. 5th row. Near the exit, a folding chair wedged between a ficus and a drafty vent. I sat there. From my seat, I could see Olivia standing near the casket. She looked perfect. Structured grief, controlled sorrow. Her blonde hair was pulled into a low chignon, her posture military straight. She didn't look at me, not once. But I knew she'd seen me, and that made it worse. Because indifference, when it comes from someone who once knew your secrets, cuts deeper than hate. Aunt Carolyn turned in her seat and whispered something to the woman beside her. They both glanced back at me, then turned away in unison, like a rehearsed maneuver. I breathed slowly, in, out, counted the seconds between exhales. I wasn't angry, not yet. But the air here, it tasted like memory, and memory has sharp teeth. The service began with hymns my mother used to hum absently while doing laundry. They sounded different here, hollow, ceremonial, as if even the melody had forgotten how to feel. The officiant, a retired Navy chaplain, stood stiff at the lectern and offered platitudes. A mother, a patriot, a woman of discipline and sacrifice. His words were careful, polished, sanitized. Then it was Olivia's turn. She approached the podium like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Her heels clicked once, sharply, against the hardwood. A pause. She looked out at the crowd, poised, sombre, and began. Our mother was many things. Disciplined, brave, composed under pressure. She taught us the value of honour, and she showed us how to carry a name with pride. The emphasis on us wasn't subtle. She raised 2 daughters, Olivia continued, eyes never once flicking toward me. But one of us stayed. One of us chose family, service, and legacy. A ripple passed through the audience. Some stiffened, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. And while life separates us in ways we can't always control, we each get to choose what we stand for. Mom believed that. She believed in consequences. The air grew heavier with each syllable. My heart didn't race, but something colder crept into my bones. I kept my eyes on the back of Olivia's head, the way her hair was pinned tight like a soldier's beret. So today, she said, voice catching for the first time, I want to thank her for never giving up on the people who stayed, who didn't run. Another glance across the room, still not at me, but just above my row. Close enough. Applause, real applause. Not loud, but enough to make my throat close. I stared straight ahead, hands folded neatly in my lap. I'd faced warlords with landmines under their chairs. I'd lied under sodium pentothal and passed every polygraph with a smile. But nothing, not torture, not terror, felt quite like this. The slow dismantling of identity, the public confirmation that I had been erased. And the worst part? They thought they were right. After Olivia stepped down, the podium stayed empty for a beat too long. Then Uncle Gerald rose, grey suit, veteran pin glinting, voice already thick with sentiment. He cleared his throat and looked toward the casket. My sister raised her daughters with strength and high standards, he began. One of them, he turned slightly toward Olivia, embodied those values in every way. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Laughter would have been inappropriate, but a few smirks flickered in the third row. I caught them like stabs of light between ribs. Family is more than blood, he continued. It's about who shows up, who's present when it matters. The words dropped like stones in water, calm on the surface but calculated. It wasn't just him. As the minutes passed, more relatives stood up to speak, and each of them, without naming me, pointed at me. In metaphors, in omissions, in practiced silences. Some of us, said Aunt Caroline, dabbing dry eyes, never stopped believing in the value of duty. We all stumble, said Olivia's husband, but some crawl so far from their roots they forget which way home is. Each word was a scalpel, surgical, clean, and familiar. This wasn't new. This was rehearsed hatred, refined over years. I was the sin they all needed to believe they'd never commit. I stared at the floor tiles. Beige, speckled, one cracked near the left corner, the kind of thing I wouldn't normally notice. But now, every detail became a distraction from the tightening in my throat. My hands rested calmly on my knees, but my nails dug crescents into my skin. I welcomed the sting, because pain was better than rage. Pain could be controlled. Then came the final cut. A woman I barely recognized stood, probably a cousin's wife, and said, smiling sweetly, "Some people think disappearing makes them mysterious, but really it just makes them forgettable." That one landed. A few heads turned my way, deliberately this time. Someone in the back chuckled. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not yet. Because when they pushed you low enough, the only way out is up. And I knew what was coming. The murmurs around me grew louder, but then a shift rippled through the crowd, subtle, almost imperceptible. It started when the double doors at the back of the room swung open. He stepped inside quietly, but the atmosphere cracked like thunder. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp uniform that carried weight beyond rank, someone who didn't need an introduction, yet demanded one with his presence alone. General Marcus Elroy. The room seemed to hold its breath. Heads turned, not out of respect, but unease. Whispers hushed instantly. Even Olivia's smug gaze faltered for a fraction of a second. He scanned the crowd, eyes sharp and calm, then locked onto me. For a moment, our gazes met. No words, just recognition. A silent acknowledgement of battles fought in shadows. Elroy's arrival changed everything. The subtle attacks, the whispered judgments, the cold dismissals, they lost their edge, because with him here, the narrative was shifting. A few guests straightened, the energy in the room sharpened, taut as a drawn bow. The chaplain cleared his throat nervously and rushed through the remaining eulogies, skipping over some names and stories, as if sensing the rising tension. I sat up straighter, feeling the weight of unseen eyes tracking me, not with scorn, but with curiosity. It was as if Elroy's presence pulled me from the shadows, forcing everyone to reconsider. Olivia's posture stiffened, her eyes darting to her phone, fingers twitching nervously. My mother's grip on her handbag tightened, the smile she wore now more brittle than genuine. Some whispered about protocol breaches. Others exchanged worried glances. And somewhere in the background, I caught a hint of relief. Because suddenly, I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was a general. And generals don't fade into the background. The room was a pressure cooker, every whispered insult, every sideways glance piling on like a storm about to break. I felt it coiling inside me, a quiet fury, a resolve sharpened by years of silence and invisibility. Then something inside me shifted. I stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, and every head snapped toward me like I'd fired a gun. Olivia's mouth tightened. The room held its breath. I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence stretch long enough to crack the coldest stare. When I finally did, my voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of all the ignored truths. For years, I began, I've been the ghost you pretended not to see, the daughter who doesn't fit the narrative you cherish. Murmurs rippled, but I pressed on. I wasn't absent by choice. I wasn't lost. I was fighting a war you never asked about. A war without parades or medals to display. Eyes widened. Olivia's lips parted, a flicker of disbelief. Operation Iron Relay. Some of you might have heard whispers. I was there. I planned missions that saved lives. I rerouted convoys, stopped attacks before they happened, and carried burdens you couldn't fathom. The silence deepened, heavier now, charged. You think my service was desk work, paperwork, logistics. Try telling that to the families who got the phone calls I prevented. Try explaining that to the soldiers alive because I was unseen. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. My father's jaw clenched. I am Brigadier General Evelyn Hart, I said, voice rising just enough, and I am not the mistake you hoped I was. The room cracked open like an earthquake. Someone gasped, cameras clicked. For the first time, the story they told themselves didn't fit reality. I looked directly at Olivia, then at my mother. You can't erase what I've done or the lives I've saved, but you tried, didn't you, to make me invisible, to keep me small. I paused, letting the weight sink in. But the truth always finds a way to surface. And today you see me, not the shadow, not the footnote, but the woman who earned every star. I lowered my voice, softer now, but unyielding. And I am done being invisible. I sat back down, the room still shaking with the echoes of my words. Olivia's smile had vanished. My father looked at me, not with pride, not yet, but with something new, recognition. The war was far from over, but the battlefield had shifted. The silence after my words was not the cold kind. It was different, heavier, more fragile, like a thin sheet of ice covering a deep, unknown water. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then my father shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. His eyes, usually so steady, flickered with something I hadn't seen in years, uncertainty. "Evelyn," he said quietly, voice rough with years of silence. "I didn't know." The words weren't an apology. They were an admission, a crack in the armour he'd built around his pride and expectations. My mother's gaze softened, though her lips stayed pressed in their usual tight line. Mason's eyes were wide, a mixture of awe and regret. I wanted to say more, but the moment wasn't mine to command. Instead, I watched as my family's fortress slowly began to crumble, brick by brick, with each quiet acknowledgement. Uncle Gerald cleared his throat again, this time with less bravado and more sincerity. "We've all made mistakes," he said, looking at me with a new respect. "Maybe it's time we start fixing them." Olivia, surprisingly, nodded, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The reception that followed was unlike any I'd experienced. No forced smiles, no veiled contempt, just people trying to bridge gaps long left unattended. I sat between Mason and my father, the old wounds still there but beginning to scab over. At one point, my mother reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face, a simple act, but one loaded with meaning. We didn't solve decades of distance overnight, but the silence that had once defined our family was replaced by cautious conversation. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Later that evening, after the formalities and lingering guests had thinned out, we found ourselves gathered around the worn kitchen table, the heart of the house, the silent witness to years of unspoken truths. Dad poured coffee, his hands steady but slower than I remembered. Mason cracked a rare smile, nudging me gently with an elbow as if to say, "We're finally here." Mom sat quietly, her eyes distant yet warmer, no longer armoured but vulnerable in her own way. I looked around at the faces, flawed, complicated, but unmistakably family. It was the kind of moment you don't script or prepare for. It just happens, quietly and without fanfare. Dad cleared his throat and said, "Evelyn, I've been wrong. I didn't see you. Not really. But I want to." His words weren't perfect, but they were real. "I want to know the parts of you I missed, the missions, the moments, the scars." I nodded, feeling a weight lift, not from his words alone, but from the openness in his eyes. Mum reached over and placed her hand on mine, a fragile bridge spanning years of distance. "We can't change the past," she whispered, "but maybe we can start writing a new chapter." Mason leaned in, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "We're proud of you, not just for your rank, but for who you are." The room, once heavy with unspoken grudges and invisible walls, began to breathe again. Stories started to flow, not grand declarations, but small truths shared in moments of quiet courage. We laughed softly over memories of childhood mishaps, the failed treehouse, the stubbornness that ran in our blood. There was no rush to fix everything all at once, just the patient work of rebuilding. I realised then that belonging isn't about flawless acceptance. It's about showing up again and again despite the cracks. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of invisibility lift, because finally I was seen, not as a shadow but as Evelyn Hart, and that was enough. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow on the familiar faces now gathered around the breakfast table. The tension that once clenched my chest had eased into a quiet resolve. I looked around, seeing my family not as distant figures on a stage, but as imperfect people trying to heal the fractures between us. Dad cleared his throat and offered a tentative smile, the first I'd seen in years. "I'm proud of you, Evelyn, more than words can say." It wasn't the grand declaration I'd yearned for, but it was real, and that was enough. Mum passed the coffee, her eyes meeting mine with a silent apology and a hope for better days. Mason, ever the pragmatist, cracked a grin and said, "Looks like you finally got the recognition you deserve. About time." I laughed, the sound light but genuine, filling the room with something that felt like peace. This wasn't the end of our story. There were still wounds to tend, conversations to have, and moments to mend. But the walls were down, even if only a crack, and the path ahead was clear. I reached for the compass my father had given me the night before, the symbol of guidance, trust, and unspoken love. Holding it, I felt anchored. Not just to my family, but to myself. The battles I'd fought in silence, the scars I carried, and the victories unseen were part of who I was. And now I was ready to step forward, not to seek their approval, but to honour my own journey. Because being seen, truly seen, starts with the courage to show up as you are. And for me, Evelyn Hart, that was finally enough. As I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the scent of pine and fresh dew wrapped around me like a promise. The flag fluttered gently in the breeze, the same one we'd saluted, the same one that had witnessed years of silence and now the beginning of understanding. I paused, turning back toward the house. A soft voice called my name. It was Mason. He stood there, hesitating, then smiled. "Hey, General Hart, ready for the next mission?" I chuckled, the sound lighter than it had been in years. "Always." We walked together toward the car, side by side, not siblings divided by misunderstanding, but comrades united by truth. Before I got in, Dad appeared at the porch, holding a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this for you," he said, voice steady but sincere. I unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, no, a memoir, a tribute, chronicling my career, my sacrifices, my strength. The story he'd promised to tell, now in his own words. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of finally being acknowledged. "This is just the beginning," Dad said softly. "I'm proud of the woman you became." I nodded, feeling a warmth I hadn't known I was missing. The past wouldn't erase overnight, but here, in this moment, we had found a truce. One built on honesty, respect, and a shared understanding that legacy isn't just about medals or ceremonies. It's about the battles fought in the shadows and the courage to finally step into the light. I climbed into the car, the compass heavy in my pocket. As the engine hummed to life, I looked out the window at the house fading behind me, not as a place of exclusion, but as a chapter closed and a new story waiting to be written. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't walking it alone. I was Evelyn Hart, general, daughter, sister, and finally wholly seen, and that was a victory no ceremony could ever match.